117-366 is adopted, and the bill as amended is considered read. The bill as amended is debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee of Natural Resources and their prospective designees. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Dingell, and the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Westerman, each will control 30 minutes. House is not in order. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Arizona. From Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend the remarks and to insert extraneous material on H.R. 2773.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 2773, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act of 2022. This legislation has been years in the making, and this moment is the culmination of the collected work of a bipartisan group of members, a strong, diverse coalition of advocates and grassroots support from across the country. This work began in 2015 when the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which represents state fish and wildlife agencies across the country, established a blue ribbon panel on sustaining Americans' diverse fish and wildlife resources. After working closely with hunting and fishing organizations, as well as partners in the sportsmen's community, businesses, and other advocates, it was decided that we needed a 21st century model of funding conservation to address the current shortfalls in wildlife conservation. Because right now, the United States is facing an unprecedented biodiversity crisis. One-third of all bird species are in need of urgent conservation action. In fact, the number of birds in the United States and Canada have fallen by 29% since 1970, a decline of almost 3 billion fewer birds. We've seen similar declines across the board. For example, 40% of freshwater fish species are also at risk, and 1/3 of all U.S. wildlife species are currently imperiled or vulnerable. These developments threaten our common environmental heritage, reduce opportunities for outdoor recreation, and will require costly and aggressive interventions if not addressed soon. This legislation is particularly critical for the sportsmen's community. As one of the co-chairs of the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus, I've always said that sportsmen and women are some of our best conservation advocates, as they understand the on-the-ground reality of the decline in wildlife and the importance of cost-effective conservation. And their input has been critical to the historic and innovative legislation before us today. Because without a change in the way we finance fish and wildlife conservation, the list of federally threatened and endangered species will balloon from nearly 1,600 species today to thousands more in the future. The cost of inaction is immense. The longer we wait to address this issue, the more resources we will ultimately need to safeguard our nation's wildlife and environment. And we cannot keep waiting. We must take the bold, urgent action that addresses the scale of the threat. We need strong, proactive conservation measures to address these unmet needs, and that is why the Recovering America's Wildlife Act is necessary. The legislation provides approximately $1.4 billion in dedicated annual funding to the states, the territories, and Native American tribes for proactive conservation efforts for the approximately 12,000 species of wildlife and plants identified under state wildlife action plans. This bold investment in our nation's wildlife will pay significant dividends. It will allow states to take proactive action that will prevent at-risk species from becoming endangered. This is critical not only to preserving our common environmental heritage, but for supporting hunters, anglers, and the almost $100 billion outdoor recreation economy. As I said previously, as one of the co-chairs of the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus, I understand the importance of these measures to support fishermen and hunters across the country. And I would like to thank my 3 fellow co-chairs of the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus, all who have sponsored the Recovering America's Wildlife Act as well. And it shows the strong bipartisan support for this bill. The broad group of stakeholders supporting the Recovery America's Wildlife Act underscores the need for action and the support for this approach. Hundreds of leading sportsmen's groups, hunting and fishing advocates across the country, conservation organizations, environmental organizations, businesses, all support this legislation for good reason. It utilizes proven funding mechanisms, boldly addresses pressing conservation needs, and prevents the need for more costly interventions in the future. The Recovering America's Wildlife Act is the product of years and years of work and consultation with these stakeholders and has broad bipartisan support. It has received bipartisan support in both the House and Senate, and the thoughtful input of my colleagues that has resulted in strong consensus legislation that will benefit every single congressional district in this country. We have a conservation, economic, and moral rationale to act in order to protect and recover America's wildlife for future generations. This is an opportunity to take historic action to address a pressing conservation need, and I ask my colleagues that they support the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves.